"You're too old to be flying. This isn't safe for someone your age," said the pilot harshly, pointing his finger at 75-year-old Henry, who sat quietly in seat 14A. "I need you to get off this plane immediately." All the first-class passengers turned to look. They couldn't understand what this calm, gentle old man could have possibly done wrong. The elderly man looked up at Captain Anderson with confusion. "I have a ticket, son. Why should I get off?" Have you ever witnessed discrimination so blatant that it left an entire cabin speechless? That morning on Flight 447 from Chicago to Denver, none of us expected to see a respected airline pilot humiliate an elderly passenger in front of everyone. But what happened next would expose a truth that changed everything we thought we knew about courage, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. This isn't just another travel story. This is about the moment when strangers became heroes, when silence became solidarity, and when one man's dignity taught an entire plane about humanity. The morning began like any other at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The terminal buzzed with its usual chaos of rolling luggage, hurried conversations in a dozen languages, and the constant drone of departure announcements echoing through the corridors. Gate 23B hosted Flight 447, a routine domestic service to Denver, scheduled for an 8:15 a.m. departure. Business travelers clutched their coffee cups like lifelines, families corralled restless children, and vacationers checked their boarding passes for the third time. Among the waiting passengers sat Henry Williams, a 75-year-old retired school teacher from suburban Chicago. He occupied a corner seat in the gate area, his worn leather briefcase resting against his leg and his wooden walking cane propped carefully beside his chair. Henry wore what he called his travel uniform, a navy blue cardigan over a pressed white shirt, comfortable slacks, and well-polished leather shoes that had carried him through 4 decades of classroom teaching. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his weathered hands held a small leather-bound notebook where he occasionally jotted down thoughts or observations. Henry had been making this journey every month for the past 2 years, ever since his son, Michael, had passed away from cancer. Today was special, though. Today marked what would have been Michael's 50th birthday, and Henry was traveling to Denver to
spend the day at his son's gravesite, sharing stories and memories as he did every month without fail. The boarding process began with the usual announcements. First-class passengers were called first, followed by premium members and families with small children. Henry gathered his belongings with the deliberate care of someone who understood that rushing only led to mistakes. He presented his boarding pass to the gate agent, a young woman named Jessica, who smiled warmly as she scanned the code. "Have a wonderful flight, Mr. Williams," she said, noting that he was a frequent passenger on this route. "Thank you, dear," Henry replied, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades teaching children to be kind to one another. The walk down the jet bridge took Henry a bit longer than other passengers, but he moved with steady purpose, his cane tapping a rhythmic pattern against the carpeted floor. Other passengers flowed around him politely, and he nodded gratefully to those who offered him space or held back to let him board without feeling rushed. Flight 447 was operated by a Boeing 737-800, configured with 12 first-class seats, 30 premium economy seats, and 142 economy seats. Henry's seat, 14A, was located in the third row of first class on the left side of the aircraft, offering him a window view and easy access to the aisle. The seat assignment wasn't about luxury for Henry. His doctor had recommended the extra legroom to help with circulation during flights, and the easier boarding and deplaning process reduced the risk of falls or accidents. As Henry settled into his seat, he followed his usual ritual. He stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, keeping only his notebook and a small photo in the seat pocket in front of him. The photo showed a younger man in a pilot's uniform standing next to an older couple, Henry and his late wife, Margaret, who had passed 3 years earlier. The pilot in the photo was Michael Williams, Henry's only child, who had followed his childhood dream of becoming a commercial airline pilot and had flown for Continental Airlines for 23 years before the company merged with another carrier.
The boarding process continued around Henry as he sat quietly, occasionally glancing out the window to watch ground crews preparing the aircraft for departure. He observed other passengers settling in, a businesswoman in seat 12B reviewing documents on her tablet, a young couple in seats 13C and 13D excitedly discussing their vacation plans, and a man in his 30s sitting across the aisle who kept checking his watch and muttering about an important meeting in Denver. Captain Anderson entered the cabin during the final boarding process, conducting his routine pre-flight inspection. At 42 years old, James Anderson had been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years and had built a reputation as a competent, if somewhat rigid, pilot. He stood 6 feet tall, with graying temples that gave him what he considered a distinguished appearance, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the final authority in any situation. As Captain Anderson walked through the first-class cabin, his trained eye automatically assessed the passengers, looking for anything that might pose a safety concern or operational issue. His gaze lingered on families with small children, passengers who appeared intoxicated, and anyone who seemed agitated or potentially disruptive. When his eyes fell on Henry Williams, something about the elderly man's appearance triggered a reaction that would soon escalate into a confrontation nobody expected. Perhaps it was the walking cane leaning against the seat, or Henry's deliberate movements as he arranged his belongings, or simply the fact that Captain Anderson was having a particularly stressful day due to delayed flights and difficult weather conditions along their route. Whatever the reason, he approached Henry's seat with an expression that immediately caught the attention of nearby passengers. "Excuse me, sir," Captain Anderson said, his tone professional but carrying an edge that suggested this wasn't a routine inquiry. "I'm Captain Anderson, and I'd like to speak with you about your flight today." Henry looked up from his notebook with the patient expression of someone accustomed to being helpful. "Of course, Captain. Is there something I can help you with?" "I need to see your boarding pass and identification, please."
The request struck Henry as unusual, since he had already presented these documents at the gate, but he complied without question. "Certainly," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket with careful movements. His arthritis made quick motions uncomfortable, but he had learned to manage the condition with patience and planning. Captain Anderson accepted the documents and examined them with what seemed like unnecessary scrutiny. He held the boarding pass up to the light, checked the photo on Henry's driver's license multiple times, and compared the information against a clipboard he carried. Other passengers began to take notice of the prolonged inspection, sensing that something unusual was happening. "Mr. Williams," Captain Anderson said finally, his voice now loud enough for several rows of passengers to hear clearly, "I have some concerns about your ability to safely complete this flight today." Henry's expression shifted from helpful cooperation to mild confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Is there a problem with my documents?" "The documents are fine," Captain Anderson replied curtly. "My concern is about your physical condition. Passengers who require mobility assistance can pose safety risks during emergency situations. I have the authority to remove anyone from this aircraft whom I deem a potential hazard to other passengers." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, newspapers lowered, and electronic devices were forgotten as passengers processed what they had just heard. Margaret Foster, a civil rights attorney in her mid-30s, sitting in seat 13A, felt her jaw drop in disbelief. David Martinez, a high school teacher in seat 14B, looked up from his book with growing alarm.
Dr. Sarah Thompson, a family physician in seat 11A, removed her reading glasses and stared at the captain with professional concern. Henry's face showed no anger or indignation, only a deep weariness that spoke of someone who had encountered this kind of treatment before. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he seemed to age several years in the span of a few seconds. "Son," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority he had used to calm frightened students for 40 decades. "I've been flying for over 50 years. I've never
caused any problems or safety issues. I understand your concerns, but I assure you that I'm perfectly capable of following safety instructions." Captain Anderson's expression hardened rather than softened at Henry's reasonable response. "That's what they all say. The problem is that in an emergency evacuation, every second counts. Passengers who can't move quickly put everyone at risk. You're clearly elderly, you're using a walking aid, and frankly, first class is intended for business travelers and people who actually need to be somewhere important." The last comment crossed a line that several passengers immediately recognized as discriminatory. Margaret Foster felt her legal training kick in as she processed the captain's words. Not only was he engaging in age discrimination, but he was also making assumptions about Henry's purpose for traveling and his right to purchase first-class accommodations. "Excuse me, Captain," Margaret said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm an attorney, and what you're describing sounds like discrimination based on age and disability status. That's illegal under federal law." Captain Anderson turned to face her with cold eyes and an expression that suggested he didn't appreciate being challenged by passengers. "Ma'am, I don't recall asking for legal advice from passengers. This is a matter of flight safety, not civil rights. I have the final authority on this aircraft, and I've determined that Mr. Williams poses an unacceptable risk." "Then I'd like to see the specific policy manual that gives you that authority," Margaret pressed, her legal instincts fully engaged. "Because I've reviewed FAA regulations extensively, and I've never encountered any provision that allows captains to remove passengers based solely on age or the use of mobility aids." Other passengers began to murmur their agreement and support for Margaret's challenge. Robert Chen, a college professor in seat 15C, nodded approvingly and reached for his phone to document the exchange, though a flight attendant quickly asked him to stop recording, citing airline policy about filming crew members without consent. Henry raised his hand slightly, a gesture that somehow commanded attention despite its gentleness. The motion was familiar to anyone who had ever been in a classroom where a teacher needed to restore order without raising their voice. "Please," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible throughout the first-class cabin. "I don't want to cause trouble for anyone. If the captain believes I shouldn't fly today, I'll gather my things and leave." His words had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of diffusing the situation, Henry's willingness to accept unfair treatment only intensified the outrage of his fellow passengers. David Martinez, who taught high school students about civil rights and social justice, felt his professional convictions ignite. "No, sir," David said firmly, addressing Henry directly. "This is wrong, and you shouldn't have to accept it. You paid for your ticket just like everyone else, and you have every right to be here." Dr. Thompson decided that her medical expertise was relevant to the discussion. "Captain Anderson, I'm a licensed physician with over 15 years of experience. I've observed Mr. Williams since boarding, and I see no medical reason why he cannot complete this flight. His mobility appears adequate for normal passenger activities, and he's clearly mentally sharp and capable of following instructions." "Doctor or not," Captain Anderson replied, his voice rising with frustration, "I'm the pilot in command of this aircraft, and federal aviation regulations give me final authority over all safety decisions. My decision is final, and Mr. Williams will be leaving this plane." The captain's increasingly aggressive tone was having an effect he didn't anticipate. Rather than intimidating the passengers into submission, his behavior was galvanizing them into action. These weren't professional activists or troublemakers. They were ordinary people, business travelers, teachers, doctors, engineers, who were witnessing something that violated their fundamental sense of fairness. Henry had begun to slowly gather his belongings, moving with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the boarding process. He retrieved his briefcase from the overhead compartment, closed his notebook, and prepared to return the photo to his jacket pocket. The sight of this dignified, elderly man being forced to leave struck something deep in the hearts of the other passengers. That's when something extraordinary happened. Margaret Foster stood up and stepped into the aisle. "Captain Anderson, if Mr. Williams cannot fly on this aircraft, then I'm getting off too."
Her declaration sent a ripple of electricity through the cabin. David Martinez immediately followed her lead. "Same here. I teach my students about standing up for what's right, and I'm not going to sit here while an innocent man is discriminated against." Dr. Thompson rose from her seat as well. "As a physician, I took an oath to do no harm. Allowing this injustice to continue would violate that oath. I'm leaving too." One by one, other first-class passengers began standing. Robert Chen closed his laptop and stood up. "This is wrong, and I won't be part of it." The businessman who had been complaining about his important meeting looked around at his fellow passengers, seemed to wrestle with his conscience for a moment, then stood as well. "My meeting isn't more important than this man's dignity." Within 5 minutes, nearly the entire first-class section was standing in solidarity with Henry Williams. The only passengers who remained seated were an elderly couple who appeared confused by the situation, and a young woman who seemed torn between standing and remaining in her seat. Captain Anderson stared at the scene in disbelief. In 15 years of flying, he had never encountered passenger rebellion on this scale. His authority, which had seemed absolute just moments before, was now being openly challenged by people who were willing to sacrifice their own travel plans for the sake of a stranger. "What exactly do you think you're accomplishing?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "We're demonstrating that some principles matter more than getting to our destination on time," Margaret replied calmly. "This gentleman deserves to be treated with the same respect and dignity that we would want for our own family members." Henry looked around at the faces of these strangers who were willing to disrupt their own lives for his sake. His eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "You don't have to do this for me. I've dealt with this kind of treatment before."
"That's exactly why we do have to do this," Dr. Thompson said firmly. "Because you've had to deal with it before, and that's not acceptable. If we don't stand up now, when will we?" The confrontation was beginning to affect the rest of the aircraft as well. Passengers in premium economy and coach had begun to notice the commotion in first class, and word was spreading quickly through the cabin about what was happening. Flight attendants were whispering urgently into their radios, and through the windows, ground crew members had stopped their work to observe the unusual scene unfolding inside the aircraft. Susan Clark, the lead flight attendant, approached Captain Anderson with visible concern. She had worked for the airline for 12 years and had never seen a situation escalate to this level. "Sir, ground control is asking about the delay. They want to know if we need assistance, and we have 3 flights backing up behind us." For the first time since the confrontation began, Captain Anderson showed signs of uncertainty. The confident authority he had displayed earlier was beginning to crack under the pressure of the situation he had created. He looked around the cabin at the standing passengers, the concerned flight attendants, and the growing crowd of ground personnel gathering outside the aircraft. Henry slowly lowered himself back into his seat, moving with the careful dignity that had characterized all his actions that morning. "Captain Anderson,"
he said quietly. "Might I ask you something personal?" The pilot turned to face him, his expression wary. "What?" "Do you have family, son? Parents, grandparents perhaps, children of your own?" The question caught Captain Anderson off guard. He had expected continued confrontation, not a gentle personal inquiry. "I don't see how that's relevant to this situation." "It's relevant because I'm wondering how you would feel if someone treated your family members the way you've treated me today. Would you want your father or grandfather to be humiliated in front of strangers simply because they needed a cane to walk?"
"That's exactly why we do have to do this," Dr. Thompson said firmly. "Because you've had to deal with it before, and that's not acceptable. If we don't stand up now, when will we?" The confrontation was beginning to affect the rest of the aircraft as well. Passengers in premium economy and coach had begun to notice the commotion in first class, and word was spreading quickly through the cabin about what was happening. Flight attendants were whispering urgently into their radios, and through the windows, ground crew members had stopped their work to observe the unusual scene unfolding inside the aircraft. Susan Clark, the lead flight attendant, approached Captain Anderson with visible concern. She had worked for the airline for 12 years and had never seen a situation escalate to this level. "Sir, ground control is asking about the delay. They want to know if we need assistance, and we have 3 flights backing up behind us." For the first time since the confrontation began, Captain Anderson showed signs of uncertainty. The confident authority he had displayed earlier was beginning to crack under the pressure of the situation he had created. He looked around the cabin at the standing passengers, the concerned flight attendants, and the growing crowd of ground personnel gathering outside the aircraft. Henry slowly lowered himself back into his seat, moving with the careful dignity that had characterized all his actions that morning. "Captain Anderson," he said quietly, "might I ask you something personal?" The pilot turned to face him, his expression wary. "What?" "Do you have family, son? Parents, grandparents perhaps, children of your own?" The question caught Captain Anderson off guard. He had expected continued confrontation, not a gentle personal inquiry. "I don't see how that's relevant to this situation." "It's relevant because I'm wondering how you would feel if someone treated your family members the way you've treated me today. Would you want your father or grandfather to be humiliated in front of strangers simply because they needed a cane to walk?" The simple, direct question hung in the air like a challenge. Captain Anderson opened his mouth to respond, then closed it without speaking. Around them, passengers waited in tense silence, sensing that they were witnessing a pivotal moment. Margaret Foster recognized the opportunity that Henry's question had created. As an attorney, she understood the power of allowing people to reach their own conclusions rather than having solutions imposed on them. "Captain," she said gently, "we're all reasonable people here. Mr. Williams has done absolutely nothing wrong. He has a valid ticket. He's caused no disturbance. He's been nothing but polite and cooperative, and he's clearly capable of following safety instructions. Multiple passengers and a licensed physician have vouched for his fitness to fly. Why don't we all take our seats and continue with the flight as scheduled?" Captain Anderson looked around the cabin at the faces watching him. Some showed anger, others disappointment, but many displayed something that was harder to dismiss: expectation that he would choose to do the right thing. These weren't unreasonable people or professional troublemakers. They were ordinary citizens who had been moved to extraordinary action by a fundamental sense of justice. A voice crackled over his radio from the cockpit. "Captain Anderson, Tower is requesting an immediate update on our departure status. We're now 15 minutes behind schedule and holding up multiple aircraft."
The pressure was mounting from all directions. Captain Anderson had backed himself into a corner with his initial decision, and now he faced the choice of either doubling down on his mistake or finding a way to gracefully retreat. The professional consequences of continuing the confrontation were becoming clear. Delayed flights, angry passengers, potential media attention, and almost certain involvement from corporate management and federal regulators. Henry reached into his briefcase and withdrew the small photograph he had been looking at earlier. Without saying a word, he held it out to Captain Anderson. The image showed a young man in a pilot's uniform, standing between an older couple and smiling broadly at the camera. "That's my son, Michael," Henry said quietly, his voice filled with both pride and sadness. "He was a pilot too. Flew commercial aircraft for Continental Airlines for
23 years before they merged with another carrier. He always said that being a pilot meant taking care of everyone on board, regardless of who they were, where they came from, or what they looked like." Captain Anderson took the photograph and stared at it for a long moment. The young pilot in the image looked confident and happy, surrounded by people who clearly loved him. "He looks like a good man," Anderson said softly. "He was the best man I ever knew," Henry replied. "He used to tell me stories about difficult passengers, emergency situations, and challenging flights, but he always said that the most important part of his job wasn't flying the airplane. It was making sure that every person who stepped onto his aircraft felt safe, welcome, and valued." Captain Anderson continued to study the photograph. "Used to tell you? Does he not fly anymore?" "Cancer took him 2 years ago," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was only 47 years old. I'm flying to Denver today to visit his grave. It's his birthday today. He would have been 50. The revelation hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped audibly, others covered their faces with their hands, and more than one person wiped away tears. Margaret Foster felt her professional composure crack as she processed the profound injustice of what had just occurred. Here was a grieving father traveling to honor his deceased son, a son who had shared Captain Anderson's own profession, and Anderson had tried to humiliate him in front of a plane full of strangers. Dr. Thompson closed her eyes and shook her head, thinking of her own parents and how she would feel if they were treated this way while trying to visit her grave. David Martinez thought of his students and the lessons about dignity and respect that he tried to teach them every day. Robert Chen reflected on his own aging parents and the fear he had that they might encounter this kind of discrimination as they grew older. Captain Anderson handed the photograph back to Henry with visibly shaking hands. The confident authority he had displayed earlier had completely evaporated, replaced with what appeared to be genuine remorse and shame.
"Mr. Williams," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong." Henry accepted the photograph and tucked it carefully back into his jacket pocket. "Son, apologies are important, but they're not enough. What matters now is what you do next." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I won't be the last elderly passenger you encounter, and they might not have people willing to stand up for them the way these folks did for me. The question is whether you'll remember this moment the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance or their age." Captain Anderson nodded slowly, the weight of Henry's words sinking in. He looked around the cabin at the passengers who were still standing, still showing their support for a man they had never met before today. "You're right," he said finally. Then, addressing the entire first-class cabin, he continued, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize not just to Mr. Williams, but to all of you for the disruption I caused today. There will be no further delays, and Mr. Williams, you are absolutely welcome aboard Flight 447. In fact, it would be an honor
to have you as our passenger." The tension in the cabin seemed to release all at once, like air escaping from a balloon. Passengers began returning to their seats, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Instead of the usual polite indifference that characterized most flights, there was a sense of shared experience and mutual respect that would continue throughout the journey. As Captain Anderson prepared to return to the cockpit, he paused one more time beside Henry's seat. "Your son," he said. "What kind of pilot was he?" Henry's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile he had shown since boarding the aircraft. "The kind who would have stood up for me today, just like these wonderful people did for me. The kind who understood that flying isn't just about getting from point A to point B. It's about treating every person on board like they matter."
Captain Anderson nodded, understanding the implicit message in Henry's words. "I hope I can learn to be that kind of pilot too." "You already took the first step," Henry replied. "Admitting when you're wrong isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength." The captain returned to the cockpit with a great deal to think about, and within minutes, Flight 447 was finally taxiing toward the runway. The delay had cost them nearly 30 minutes, but something valuable had been gained in the process. During the taxi and takeoff, Margaret Foster moved to the empty middle seat in Henry's row, and they began a conversation that would continue for most of the flight. She listened as Henry told stories about his son's aviation career, the challenges Michael had faced as a young pilot, and the pride Henry had felt watching his son achieve his childhood dreams. "He always wanted to fly," Henry explained, looking out the window as Chicago grew smaller below them. "Even as a little boy, he would spend hours at the airport just watching planes take off and land. When he finally got his commercial license, he called me, crying with joy. He said it felt like he was living in a dream." Margaret found herself deeply moved by Henry's stories. As an attorney, she dealt with conflict and injustice on a daily basis, but there was something about this gentle man's grace in the face of discrimination that affected her profoundly. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you stay so calm and dignified when people treat you badly?" Henry was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "When you've lived as long as I have, you learn that anger doesn't solve problems, it just creates new ones. My son taught me that the best way to respond to ugliness is with beauty, to hatred with love, and to ignorance with patience." David Martinez, seated directly behind Henry, couldn't help but overhear parts of their conversation. As a teacher, he was always looking for real-world examples to help his students understand important concepts, and Henry's behavior that day had provided a masterclass in dignity under pressure.
"Mr. Williams," David said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm a high school teacher, and I wonder if you'd be willing to let me share your story with my students. Not the personal details about your son, of course, but the way you handled what happened today. I think they could learn a lot from your example." Henry turned in his seat to face David. "What do you teach, son?" "Social studies and civics. I try to help kids understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens and how to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." "Then you're doing important work," Henry said with a smile. "And yes, you're welcome to share the story, but make sure you tell them about the real heroes today. Tell them about the people who stood up when it mattered. Tell them about the pilot who found the courage to admit he was wrong. Those are the lessons that matter." Dr. Thompson, who had been listening to the conversation from her seat one row ahead, turned around to join the discussion. "Mr. Williams, I have to ask, have you experienced this kind of treatment before? You seemed almost prepared for it." Henry's expression grew sad. "Unfortunately, yes. Getting older in America isn't always easy, especially when you need mobility aids or move a little slower than others. People make assumptions about your capabilities, your intelligence, your worth. Most of the time I just accept it and move on. But today was different." "What made today different?"
Margaret asked. Today, I wasn't alone. Today, people chose to stand up with me instead of looking the other way. That made all the difference in the world. The conversation continued throughout the flight, with other passengers occasionally joining in. The businessman who had initially complained about his important meeting introduced himself as Thomas Bradley and admitted that he had almost remained seated during the confrontation. "I was thinking about my schedule, my client meeting, all the usual selfish concerns," Thomas said. "But then I looked at you sitting there so calmly, and I thought about my own grandfather. He passed away last year, and toward the end, people sometimes
Treated him like he was invisible or incompetent. I always regretted not standing up for him more often. Today gave me a chance to do what I should have done for him." Robert Chen shared a similar sentiment. "My parents immigrated to this country when I was young, and they faced discrimination because of their accent and their unfamiliarity with American customs. Strangers rarely stood up for them. Seeing everyone support you today reminded me of how much those small acts of courage can mean." Even the young woman who had initially hesitated to stand eventually joined the group conversation. Lisa Kark, a graduate student in psychology, explained her internal struggle during the confrontation. "I kept thinking I should stand up, but I was afraid of making things worse or causing more delays," she admitted. "I'm studying social psychology, and I've read about the bystander effect, how people are less likely to help when they're in groups because they assume someone else will take action. Today, I saw the opposite. I saw people choosing to get involved, even when it was inconvenient." As Flight 447 cruised at 35,000 feet above the American heartland, something remarkable was happening in the first-class cabin. Strangers were becoming friends, sharing stories about their families, their work, their hopes and fears. The confrontation that had started the flight had created a bond between people who might otherwise never have spoken to each other. Captain Anderson's voice came over the intercom as they began their descent into Denver. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, I want to take a moment to address what happened during boarding today. I made a serious error in judgment, and I want to publicly acknowledge that Mr. Williams was treated unfairly. Travel should bring us together across all kinds of differences, and today I learned that sometimes the people we're quick to judge have the most to teach us about dignity, grace, and forgiveness. Thank you for flying with us today, and please remember to treat your fellow travelers with the kindness and respect they deserve." The announcement was met with spontaneous applause throughout the aircraft, not just in first class, but from passengers who had heard about the situation from flight attendants or other travelers. When they touched down in Denver, Captain Anderson made an unusual decision. Instead of remaining in the cockpit during deplaning,
Positioned himself in the galley to personally thank passengers for their patience and to speak with Henry one final time. Henry was among the last to disembark, taking his time as he always did to ensure he didn't rush or stumble. When he reached the front of the aircraft, Captain Anderson was waiting with something in his hand. "Mr. Williams," the captain said, "I wanted to give you these." He held out a pair of small golden wings, the kind that airlines sometimes give to children, but crafted from real metal and clearly of high quality. "These belong to my father. He was a pilot too, flew cargo planes during the Korean War, and later worked for a small regional airline. He always said that true authority doesn't come from rank or position. It comes from recognizing the humanity and dignity in every person you encounter." Henry accepted the wings with trembling hands, clearly moved by the gesture. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was, and so was your son, I imagine. I hope that someday I can be the kind of pilot they both would have respected." "You already took the most important step," Henley said. "You chose to grow instead of defending your mistake. That's what separates good people from great ones." As Henry walked slowly through the jet bridge and into the Denver terminal, several of his fellow passengers were waiting to say goodbye. Margaret Foster pressed her business card into his hand and made him promise to call if he ever experienced discrimination again. David Martinez took a photo with Henry, explaining that he wanted to show his own grandfather and his students an example of true dignity. Dr. Thompson hugged him gently and told him that his grace under pressure had reminded her why she became a doctor. But Henry politely declined Thomas Bradley's offer to share a taxi to the city, explaining that he preferred to make this particular journey alone. "This is something I need to do by myself," he said. "But knowing that there are still good people in the world like all of you makes every step of the journey worthwhile." As Henry made his way through the terminal, moving slowly but steadily with his cane, several airport employees who had heard about the incident from crew members made small gestures of respect. A security guard helped him navigate through a crowded area. A restaurant worker refused to let him pay for his coffee. A baggage handler gave him directions to the taxi stand and made sure he was safely seated before his driver pulled away. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters. It wasn't a complaint or a lawsuit threat. Instead, it was a letter of commendation for Captain Anderson, written in Henry's careful handwriting and praising the pilot for his courage in admitting his mistake and his commitment to growing from the experience. The letter included a paragraph that would later be framed and displayed in the airline's training facility. Flying isn't just about getting from one place to another. It's about the journey we take together as human beings, the dignity we show each other along the way, and the courage to stand up for what is right even when it's difficult or inconvenient. The passengers on Flight 447 reminded me that there are still people willing to put principle before convenience, and Captain Anderson showed that true leadership sometimes means admitting when you're wrong and committing to do better. Captain Anderson kept that letter in his flight bag for the rest of his career. Whenever he encountered a situation that required extra patience or compassion, he would remember the lesson taught to him by a 75-year-old man with a walking cane and a photograph of his deceased son.
The airline's corporate leadership used the incident as a case study in their customer service and diversity training programs. Rather than trying to suppress the story or minimize its significance, they embraced it as an opportunity to examine their policies and procedures. The company implemented new guidelines requiring additional training for crew members on issues related to age discrimination and disability rights. More importantly, they created a passenger advocate program that allowed travelers to report discriminatory treatment directly to corporate management, bypassing the traditional customer service channels that often resulted in form letters and token gestures. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Flight 447 was on the passengers themselves. Margaret Foster began volunteering with senior citizens advocacy organizations and started taking pro bono cases involving age discrimination. She discovered a passion for elder rights law that transformed her legal career and led to significant victories for older Americans facing various forms of prejudice. David Martinez incorporated the story into his curriculum, using it as a real-world example of civic engagement and moral courage. His students were deeply moved by the account, and several of them started volunteer programs at local nursing homes and senior centers. The story became a touchstone for discussions about standing up for others and the responsibility that comes with witnessing injustice. Dr. Thompson made a commitment to always speak up when she witnessed unfair treatment of vulnerable populations. As a physician, she had sometimes remained quiet during problematic interactions between medical staff and elderly or disabled patients, telling herself that it wasn't her place to intervene. After Flight 447, she became a vocal advocate for patient dignity and respectful treatment in healthcare settings. Thomas Bradley, the businessman who had almost remained seated, started a mentorship program for young professionals that emphasized ethical leadership and moral courage in corporate settings.
He often told the story of Flight 447 to illustrate the point that doing the right thing sometimes requires personal sacrifice and professional risk. Robert Chen and Lisa Park collaborated on a research project about bystander intervention and moral courage, using their shared experience on Flight 447 as a case
Starting point for studying how ordinary people can be motivated to take extraordinary action in defense of others. 6 months after the flight, Henry received thank you cards from each of the passengers who had stood up for him. Each card contained a personal message about how the experience had affected them and how they had tried to honor the memory of his son Michael by treating others with greater kindness and respect. Henry kept these cards in a special box alongside letters from his former students, photos of his late wife, and mementos from his son's aviation career. They served as reminders that even in the darkest moments, human goodness could shine through if people chose to let it. Today, nearly 2 years after Flight 447, Henry continues his monthly pilgrimages to Denver to visit Michael's grave. He still flies first class, not out of any sense of entitlement, but because his doctor continues to recommend the extra legroom and easier boarding process. He still moves carefully through airports with his walking cane, still sits quietly in his assigned seat, and still carries the small photograph of his son in his jacket pocket. But something fundamental has changed about these journeys. Airline crews across the country have learned Henry's story through corporate training programs and word of mouth among aviation professionals. Instead of seeing him as a potential problem or safety risk, they recognize him as a reminder of why their jobs matter and how they can make a positive difference in people's lives. Flight attendants often make a point of checking on Henry during flights, not because they think he needs special assistance, but because they want to ensure he feels welcome and valued. Pilots sometimes visit him during boarding to shake his hand and share stories about their own family members or their respect for the aviation profession. Gate agents recognize his name on passenger manifests and make sure his boarding process goes smoothly. These gestures might seem small to outside observers, but they represent a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry thinks about customer service and human dignity. Henry's experience on Flight 447 has become part of the cultural memory of American commercial aviation, a reminder that respect and kindness should be the baseline for every passenger interaction, not special privileges reserved for certain travelers. The ripple effects of that March morning continue to spread in ways that Henry himself might never fully realize. Margaret Foster's legal advocacy has resulted in policy changes at multiple airlines and has inspired a new generation of civil rights attorneys to focus on issues affecting older Americans. Her blog post about Flight 447 has been translated into multiple languages and is used in diversity training programs around the world. David Martinez's students have gone on to college and careers, carrying with them the lessons they learned from Henry's example. Several of them have become teachers themselves, passing along the story to new generations of young people. Others have entered careers in social work, public service, and advocacy, motivated by the understanding that ordinary people have the power to create extraordinary change. Dr. Thompson's advocacy for patient dignity has transformed the culture at her hospital and influenced her colleagues to be more mindful of how they treat vulnerable populations. She frequently tells the story of Henry Williams to medical students and resident physicians, using it to illustrate the importance of seeing patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms or problems to be solved. Thomas Bradley's mentorship program has reached hundreds of young business professionals who might otherwise have learned to prioritize profit and efficiency over human values.
Many of these mentees have gone on to leadership positions where they've implemented more ethical and compassionate business practices, creating a multiplier effect that extends far beyond the original incident on Flight 447. The academic research conducted by Robert Chen and Lisa Park has contributed to a growing body of knowledge about moral courage and bystander intervention. Their work has influenced training programs for law enforcement officers, healthcare workers, educators, and other professionals who regularly encounter situations where they must choose between convenience and doing the right thing. Captain Anderson, now a senior pilot with additional responsibilities for training new aviators, tells the story of Flight 447 to every class of aspiring commercial pilots he instructs. He emphasizes that technical flying skills are only part of what makes someone a successful pilot. The ability to treat passengers with dignity and respect is equally important.
Flying is a privilege, he tells his students. And every person who steps onto your aircraft is entrusting you not just with their physical safety, but with their emotional well-being. They deserve your best effort, your professional competence, and your basic human respect, regardless of their age, their appearance, their economic status, or any other factor that might tempt you to make quick judgments. The airline industry as a whole has embraced the lessons of Flight 447. Incorporating age discrimination awareness into standard training programs, and developing more comprehensive policies for handling situations involving passengers with mobility aids or other accessibility needs. The story has become a case study in business schools, law schools, and public policy programs, demonstrating how individual moral courage can drive systemic change. But perhaps the most profound impact has been on the concept of air travel itself. For too many years, flying had become an increasingly dehumanizing experience, with passengers treated as cargo to be efficiently processed, rather than people deserving of courtesy and respect. The story of Henry Williams and the strangers who stood up for him reminded the industry that aviation is fundamentally about bringing people together, connecting families, enabling business relationships, and making the world a little smaller and more accessible. On a sunny Thursday morning in May, almost exactly 2 years after Flight 447, Henry Williams once again walked slowly through the boarding area at Chicago O'Hare, heading for his monthly trip to Denver. As had become his custom, he wore his navy cardigan, carried his worn leather briefcase, and moved carefully with his wooden cane. But this time something was different. Pinned to his cardigan, just above his heart, were 2 small golden wings, the ones given to him by Captain Anderson, polished to a bright shine and worn with quiet pride. They had become part of his travel routine, a reminder of the day when strangers became heroes, and a pilot learned that true authority comes from admitting your mistakes rather than defending them. As Henry presented his boarding pass at Gate 23B for another Flight 447 to Denver, the gate agent, a young man named Christopher, recognized him immediately. "Mr. Williams," Christopher said with a warm smile, "welcome back. How are you feeling today?"
"I'm doing well, son," Henry replied, as he always did. "Looking forward to visiting my boy. Please let me know if there's anything at all I can do to make your flight more comfortable." Henry thanked him and made his way slowly down the jet bridge, acknowledging the respectful nods from ground crew members who had come to know him over the months. When he reached his seat, 14A, as always, he found a small envelope waiting on his tray table. Inside was a handwritten note from the flight crew. "Mr. Williams, thank you for flying with us today and for reminding us why we love what we do. Have a peaceful visit with Michael, the crew of Flight 447." As Henry settled into his seat and arranged his belongings in their familiar pattern, he reflected on how much had changed since that difficult morning 2 years earlier.
The fear and uncertainty he had once felt about air travel had been replaced by a sense of community and belonging. He no longer wondered whether he would be welcomed aboard aircraft or treated with dignity by airline personnel. The industry had learned to see him not as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be respected. During the flight, Henry was approached by a young flight attendant named Amanda, who had heard his story during her training and wanted to thank him personally. "Mr. Williams, I just wanted to let you know that your experience has changed how I think about this job. Before I heard your story, I sometimes saw passengers as obstacles to getting through my workday efficiently. Now, I try to remember that everyone on board has their own story, their own reasons for traveling, and their own right to be treated with kindness." Henry was touched by her words, but characteristically deflected credit away from himself. The real heroes that day were the people who chose to stand up when it would have been easier to look away, and Captain Anderson, who found the courage to admit when he was wrong. Those are the lessons that matter.
But you showed all of us how to handle unfair treatment with grace and dignity, Amanda insisted. That's not something everyone could do. Henry thought for a moment before responding. When you get to be my age, you realize that anger and bitterness are luxuries you can't afford. They consume too much energy and accomplish too little good. I learned a long time ago that the best way to change hearts and minds is through example, not argument. As Flight 447 began its descent into Denver, Henry looked out the window at the familiar landscape below. The Rocky Mountains stretched across the horizon, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring weather. Somewhere in the city below was Riverside Cemetery, where Michael lay buried beneath a simple granite headstone that read, "Beloved Son and Pilot." Henry's monthly visits to the grave had become more than just moments of remembrance and grief. They had evolved into conversations about the changes he had witnessed in the aviation industry, the kindness he had experienced from strangers, and the hope he felt about the future of human decency in an often harsh world. "I think you would be proud of what's happened, son," Henry would say during these graveside conversations. "People are trying to do better. They're choosing to stand up for what's right. They're remembering that we're all in this together." After landing in Denver, Henry made his way through the familiar airport corridors toward the taxi stand. As he walked, he was approached by a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, who was traveling with her grandmother. The girl had noticed the golden wings on Henry's cardigan and was curious about their significance. "Are you a pilot?" she asked, with the innocent directness that only children possess. Henry smiled and knelt down carefully to bring himself to her eye level. "No, sweetheart, but my son was. He used to say that everyone who flies is part of the same family, whether they're piloting the plane or just riding along as passengers." The little girl's grandmother, recognizing Henry from news coverage of his story, gently explained to her granddaughter that this was the nice man who helped make flying better for everyone. As Henry continued toward the exit, he carried with him the warmth of that brief encounter and countless others like it. Children had a way of seeing past age and infirmity to recognize kindness and wisdom, reminding him that the future of human decency rested in the hands of those who were still learning what it meant to treat others with respect. The taxi ride to Riverside Cemetery gave Henry time to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. 2 years earlier, he had been just another elderly passenger, vulnerable to the prejudices and assumptions of others. Today, he was something far more powerful, a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity, and a reminder that individual courage could create lasting change. At Michael's gravesite, Henry placed a fresh bouquet of flowers, the same type he brought every month, and settled into his portable chair for their monthly conversation. The golden wings caught the afternoon sunlight as he began to speak, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "Happy birthday, son. You're 52 today, though I still sometimes think of you as that excited little boy who used to watch planes at O'Hare for hours at a time." I paused, watching clouds drift across the Colorado sky. "I have so much to tell you about what's been happening in your industry, about the people I've met, and about the changes that are taking place." Henry spent the next hour sharing stories about the passengers from Flight 447, the improvements he had witnessed in airline customer service, and the young aviation professionals who were committed to treating every traveler with dignity and respect. "I think you would have liked these people, son. They remind me of the stories you used to tell about the good days in aviation, when flying was still seen as something special, and when taking care of passengers was considered the most important part of the job." As the afternoon sun began to set behind the mountains, Henry prepared to leave the cemetery and return to the airport for his flight back to Chicago. But before he left, he had one more thing to share with his son.
"I want you to know that I'm not angry anymore about what happened that day on the plane. I was hurt and disappointed, certainly, but anger would just weigh me down. Instead, I'm grateful. Grateful for the strangers who became friends, grateful for the pilot who learned to be better, and grateful for all the positive changes that came from something that started out so badly." Henry stood slowly, using his cane for support, and placed his hand on Michael's headstone. "I'll see you next month, son. Keep watching over all those pilots up there, and help them remember what you always knew, that flying is about bringing people together, not driving them apart." The flight back to Chicago was routine and peaceful, exactly the way Henry preferred his travels to be. He spent most of the journey reading a book about the history of commercial aviation, occasionally looking up to watch the familiar landscape pass by below. When the captain announced their initial descent into O'Hare, Henry carefully bookmarked his page and prepared for landing. As passengers began to disembark, Henry waited patiently in his seat, allowing the usual rush of travelers to clear before making his own careful exit. The flight attendant who had spoken with him earlier stopped by to thank him again for his kindness and to wish him well. "Mr. Williams," she said, "I hope you had a good visit with your son." "I did. Thank you for asking. And thank you for taking such good care of all of us today." Walking through the jet bridge and back into O'Hare Airport, Henry reflected on how different this arrival felt compared to his departure that morning. He was returning not just from a trip to Denver, but from another successful example of how air travel could work when everyone involved chose to prioritize human dignity over convenience or efficiency. The golden wings on his cardigan caught the terminal lighting as he made his way toward the baggage claim area, where his neighbor would be waiting to drive him home. These small pins had become more than just a memento from Captain Anderson. They had become a symbol of transformation, redemption, and hope. Tomorrow, Henry would return to his quiet retirement routine, tending his garden, reading his books, corresponding with former students, and preparing for next month's trip to Denver. But tonight, as he settled into his comfortable chair at home and reflected on the day's journey, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The world had not become perfect. Discrimination and prejudice still existed, and there were still people who chose convenience over compassion. But something fundamental had shifted.
More people were choosing to stand up when they witnessed injustice. More professionals were treating their responsibilities as opportunities to serve others rather than simply complete tasks. More organizations were recognizing that how they treated their most vulnerable customers reflected their true values. Flight 447 had become more than just a travel experience that went wrong and then right. It had become a reminder that individual moral courage, even in small doses, could create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond the original moment. The elderly man with a walking cane and a photograph of his deceased son had not set out to change an industry or inspire strangers to become heroes. He had simply insisted on being treated with basic human dignity. But sometimes that's exactly what the world needs. Ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary grace, and other ordinary people finding the courage to stand beside them when it matters most. The story of Henry Williams and Flight 447 proved that heroes aren't always the people we expect them to be, and that the most powerful changes often begin with the simplest acts of decency. In the end, the golden wings resting on Henry's dresser that night represented far more than one pilot's apology or one passenger's forgiveness. They represented the possibility that people could choose to be better than their worst impulses, that systems could change when individuals demanded better, and that respect and dignity were not privileges to be earned, but rights to be protected. The story continues every day in airports and aircraft around the world, wherever people choose kindness over indifference, courage over convenience, and human dignity over institutional efficiency. Flight 447 reminded everyone involved that we are all passengers on this journey together, and that how we treat each other along the way matters more than how quickly we reach our destination.